We know that the government intends to take us out of the European single market, but what about the customs union? That's the zone, including countries inside and outside the EU who trade freely without tariffs or other restrictions and who collectively set a common external tariff for goods from other parts of the world. This is what Theresa May said about the customs union in her Lancaster House speech in January.
Now, I want Britain to be able to negotiate its own trade agreements, but I also want tariff-free trade with Europe and cross-border trade there to be as frictionless as possible. That means I do not want Britain to be part of the common commercial policy, and I do not want us to be bound by the common external tariff. These are the elements of the customs union that prevent us from striking our own comprehensive trade agreements with other countries. But I do want us to have a customs agreement with the EU. Whether that means we must reach a completely new customs agreement, become an associate member of the customs union in some way, or remain a signatory to some elements of it, I hold no preconceived position.
Theresa May. Well, we're joined now by Henry Newman of the Open Europe think tank, which has launched a report today calling for the UK to pursue a fully independent trade policy outside the customs union. Welcome to the programme.
Thank you.
For you, Theresa May doesn't go far enough, does she? Her clean break isn't hard enough for you. You don't even want associate membership with the European Customs Union. Is that correct?
I think she's almost there. She's been quite clear that we need to take the maximum opportunities we can from the decision that the public took last year. And we're convinced, having looked carefully at the evidence, that we now need to be completely clear that we need to get out of the customs union entirely.
Right.
And that's the best way to maximise the opportunities from leaving the European Union.
So under your plan, we leave the customs union with the rest of Europe in 2019?
Yes.
Right. Do you think
there's a possibility, of course, of a transition, and that's a separate question. But ultimately, we should be out of the customs union entirely. No halfway in, halfway out. No sectoral deal. No Turkish-style arrangement.
No sectoral deal?
No.
Right. Is there a logic to that plan?
There's a logic to all the plans, but no, I think it's too soon to say that we should write off having at least the short term being full members of the customs union, and indeed then aspiring to the sort of arrangement that Theresa May made clear in that clip we've just heard. The reason I say that is that actually a transition deal is going to be incredibly difficult to negotiate over the relatively short time period, and it may well be that we need to have an off-the-shelf option. The obvious off-the-shelf option doesn't apply, of course, to services in the way it does to goods, but it is to have a customs union arrangement. And the thing about customs union, above all, of course, is that it could be very, very difficult along the lines that Joe pointed out earlier on in this programme. That if you have a situation where there is a concern about the country of origin on goods, this could be pretty nightmarish for many of our exporters if we don't get it right, which is one of the reasons I think that Theresa May has left open the option as part of the negotiation.
Right.
Also,
Well,
there's one thing on trade deals I think we need to get. Politicians love trade deals, bureaucrats love them, civil servants love them. Actually, just get on and do trade. And I think that one of the things we've seen with the Trump administration in many ways has been this idea of a can-do attitude. Let's get on and do trade.
But you can't do the trade deals until we've effectively left the EU. That's the problem, isn't it?
There's never been a country we've done a trade deal with that we haven't been already trading with before we've done a trade deal.
Right, OK, well,
so
I mean, that may be the case. But let me come back to Henry Newman's point about half in, half out. What's wrong with that?
Well, I think we call it the worst of all possible worlds in our report, because you're tied by many of the rules, and therefore you're unable to take the opportunities that leaving would entail. And that's not just, as Mark says, about signing trade deals. Trade deals are important, but actually, in many cases, using them can be too bureaucratic for business. But if you leave, you're able to reset your tariffs externally with the WTO. So we would be able to lower all of our tariffs, not just the tariffs through a trade deal. And we also concern that a sectoral arrangement where, for example, we'd be inside the customs union just for, say, the automotive industry or the chemicals industry would be legally challengeable.
Right, but what happens then when you come out of the customs union in the way that you're describing? I mean, would there have to be any sort of facilitation agreement between the EU and the UK?
Well, let's say, first of all, that there will be some costs of us leaving, so we're quite clear that this is not a completely...
How big are those costs?
Well, there was a leaked report over the weekend reported by the Sunday Times, which pointed to costs of up to 24%. We're not convinced by those figures. Those figures were produced, as we see it, by the Treasury shortly before the referendum last year.
Right,
and we think they could be questionable.
If they're a bit lower at 20%, they're huge costs.
We think it's much more likely to be very low. And can I just say one important thing before we get to my colleague? But we already do a great deal of trade with countries which we're not in a free trade agreement with, let alone a customs union. So the single biggest trading partner for the UK is the US. We don't have a trade deal. We don't even have a customs arrangement with them.
But look, the problem with this is about who this hits and where. So we already know that the parts of the country that voted leave in the north of England will be hardest hit by Brexit. Why? Because it's those areas that are dependent on manufacturing. Now, people will tell you that manufacturing is a relatively small part of our economy, but actually a lot of the service sector in the north as well depends on the manufacturing industry to sell into. So what I regret very much is this idea that what's good for Britain is good for everybody everywhere, because people aren't thinking through the fact that saying, yes, there will be costs to this, is though there'll be costs, but, on the whole, people will gain. That's not true. Some people will bear the burden of this,
right,
and others won't, and that is not fair.
But hang on, let's say to you, you agree that there are going to be costs. You haven't exactly agreed what those costs will be, but you don't agree with 24%.
There are also
do you also
opportunities in
accept?
leaving that.
Yeah, but do you accept that outside the
for
customs
who?
union will mean more paperwork for British exporters, like British manufacturers?
Potentially. But
Right.
I think the key
So it's
is
not
the customs...
frictionless then, is
No,
it?
we don't think it will be frictionless. We're
Right,
very
okay.
clear that...
So Theresa
there will
May
have to
isn't,
be a
in your
degree of
mind, going to
friction.
have frictionless trade?
Not perfectly frictionless trade, but let's take a step back and look more broadly. We already have very efficient trade with our non-EU partners here in the UK. We have one of the most efficient customs systems in the world. So we're starting from a very positive base.
Sure.
We need to make sure that our systems are as good as they can possibly be, so that goods can pass as freely as possible. And constituents of yours and of yours will be concerned to make sure that happens. And I'm sure that everybody in Parliament and ministers will be paying attention to
Well, let's
this.
have a look. OK, but you have conceded that there are going to be costs, that
Absolutely.
it won't be frictionless. You've also said there'll be opportunities. And there shouldn't be a sectoral deal for instance, the car industry and people working in various manufacturing outposts in your constituency. Leaving the customs union will challenge companies with complex supply chains, is what you say in your report.
Yes.
So you are talking about the car industry being hit, which is worth £72 billion a year and employs 170,000 people. Is it worth it?
I think, to take a step back again, the decision was taken to leave the EU. Right. If we're going to leave the EU, we need to be clear what that actually means. I think staying in the single market, staying in the customs union, is essentially the same as not having left in the first place. So I accept that there will be costs, but these costs and these points were put to the people
we could be like
last year.
Norway. Even Nigel Farage said, in the middle of the referendum...
Well,
But that's outside the customs union.
Yeah, so he said we could be like...
Turkey, of course.
Yeah, and these countries, operate within. They have a way of operating with the single market, which I'm assuming you would call half in, half out, and that's the worst of all possible worlds. So people were told that trading arrangements would be broadly the same, and yet here we are afterwards now saying, oh, actually what we need to do is rip it all up and start again.
I'm not saying that at all.
And go after some vague notion of benefits that will be at some point in the future.
Let's look at the deals the EU already has. So the EU already has very good customs cooperation with trade partners like Switzerland, but also with Canada. So the new Canada trade deal that was signed very recently includes extensive...
But that was with the EU.
It was. So the EU already has systems in place. There are already precedents for very good customs cooperation.
Just finally...
So I'm very optimistic that this can be achieved in a way that doesn't disrupt business, including those with complex supply chains.
When we look then at Northern Ireland, do you also accept there would have to be a customs border?
There'll have to be some degree of border. Right. We can think that border can be minimised. We don't think that necessarily means stops on the actual physical border. But there will have to be a border for goods. That's not the same as a border for people. We don't see any reason why the free movement of people that long predates either British or Irish accession to the European Union will be disrupted in any way.
Well, one of the reasons that Ireland joined at the self-same date as the UK in 1973, in the height of the Troubles, was a recognition of the interdependence between the two economies. And I think a special deal will have to be done. It'll be in everyone's interest, not just those two countries, but the rest of the EU.
We're going to have to stop it there.
Kind of border.
Newman, thank you very much.
Invisible
Thank you for having me.